Good morning and welcome to a new series on stopping Bible abuse. These meditations are aimed at stopping Bible abuse. Does it matter? After all, doesn't every book, every text get abused? I mean, look at what theatre directors do to poor old Shakespeare. Does it matter that people are misusing the Bible? Well, sometimes it does. Yeah, because Christians can be led into ruinous behaviour if they think something is God's will when it isn't. Bible abuse means that you don't hear what God has to say sometimes, and that is a serious matter. So, although it may sound like a cranky old geezer riding his hobby horse, sometimes those hobby horses have to be ridden because the Bible is being abused not just by people outside the churches but also inside. And they're doing themselves and other people no good at all. And I want to take one of the most abused passages in the Bible, one of the ones that's misquoted, misdirected, misapplied, most of all. It's the old idea of being the salt of the earth, which comes from a saying which is in three of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark and Luke. And I'm going to read the version from Matthew's Gospel, and I'm going to read from the Old King James because that's the version people know best. And it's actually one of the clearer ones. You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt have lost its savour, wherewith shall it be salted? It is thenceforth good for nothing, but to be cast out and to be trodden under foot of men. You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hid. Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick, and it giveth light unto all that are in the house. Let your light so shine before men, that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. I believe these verses have been so abused that that's almost the traditional reading of this few verses is an abuse. Because people take the cue from verse 16, they think it's about doing good works. Verse 16 says, Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. And what they do is they read from the end back into the rest of the little passage, and they say, well, this must be about doing good publicly, doing good so that other people can see how good you're doing. Your good deeds must be visible. And not only must they be visible, they must be exceptional, because people are going to see them as a miraculous sign of God and glorify God because of your doing of such good deeds. Now, I've heard this text used dozens of times, always to enlist me into whatever cause or passion moves the person quoting it to me. Christian activists of every type love this verse. When I say activists, I mean those people who are always trying to get the rest of us involved in their projects. They use this verse as a call to action. They say we have to be salt in the world. We have to be light in the world. We have to do good so people can see us doing good and glorify God in heaven. That's how it's used. It's assumed that that is what Jesus is saying. So it is used to justify a certain publicly minded do-gooding, because it's not enough to do good in secret, because then the non-Christian world will not see the good you're doing. So it must be public. Secondly, whatever you do, it must be something that everyone is agreed is good. So in other words, it must be something that this world recognizes as good activity or good action. And as I said before, we must do this good so superbly that our good deeds are seen as a sign from heaven. Well, this is all nonsense. It directly contradicts Jesus' own teaching in the same Sermon on the Mount, which is that if you're going to do good, do it privately, do it secretly. Do not perform for other people. Do not do what the Pharisees do, who make sure that everyone can see their donations and praise them. They don't praise the God in heaven, they praise the Pharisees for the good they do. It's actually encouraging Christians down a wrong path, and that's why I feel strongly about it. So when nonsense gets repeated over and over again in lots of different churches, that nonsense becomes normal. But I just want to call it out. It's all nonsense. Now, I have heard some people say that, no, what's being said here is something slightly different. We have to do good to preserve the world. And here people emphasize that salt is a preservative. And so it is. When there are lots of lemons around, I guess it must be the lemon season in Spain at some point in the year, I can go down Lewisham Market, I can get a dozen lemons for £1, sometimes more. And what I do is I take them home and I salt them, and I can thoroughly recommend salted lemons as an ingredient for various Mediterranean cookery and other bits and pieces. Salt is a preservative, but there's not a hint in this passage that it's about salt being used as a pickling agent. I have heard one clever lady say that it's a reference to salt being used as a fertilizer, but I think what people used to use salt for was to throw on their manure heaps, and it seemed to settle them down chemically. Salt isn't a fertilizer in itself, but it can help if you've got a really rich, ripe manure heap to get it ready for throwing on your soil. But whether we're meant to preserve the world or whether we're meant to fertilize the world, I don't think that's what this passage is saying here, because the emphasis here is all on taste. It's about the salt being tasty as salt, and if the salt loses its taste, it's rubbish. You throw it away. It's not fit for anything. It's just ready to be trampled down by other people. So the emphasis is on the distinctive taste of salt. But who decides on that? Do I decide myself? Do I taste of salt today? How do I know? No, the person who is tasting me is God. Do I taste salty to God? Does he say, I like the taste of that guy? Does God say about you that he likes the taste of you? How about the Lighthouse Church? Does God like the taste of the church? And how would we know anyway? Well, fortunately, there is something about the taste of salt being offered to God in the Bible, and that's the grain offering that was offered in the temple in Jerusalem. Let me read this little passage. Every grain offering you bring to the Lord must be made without yeast, for you're not to burn any yeast or honey in a food offering presented to the Lord. You may bring them to the Lord as an offering of the first fruits, but they're not to be offered on the altar as a pleasing aroma. So what we're talking about here are offerings made with grain, made with flour, baked into cakes or bread, or as it is. And here's the passage, here's the sentence I want to bring to your attention. Season all your grain offerings with salt. Do not leave the salt of the covenant of your God out of your grain offerings. Add salt to all your offerings. Now that's a fascinating little idea, isn't it? The salt of the covenant of your God. That means that God, when he tastes the salt in the grain offerings, he is reminded in some way of the covenant between himself and Israel. The grain offering represents what we can do. The grain offering is our work, it's our labour offered to God. It is the work of our lives because we grow it and we prepare it, we grind it, we bake it or boil it or whatever we do with it. So the grain offering represents, it's different from the animal offerings and particularly different from the blood offerings. It's what we can give to God. And it must be salted. Without the salt of the covenant, it's useless to God. Now Cain, you know the famous story of Cain and Abel. Cain wanted to offer a grain offering, but it wasn't good enough. There had to be a blood offering before the grain offering could be brought. And that's what the law of Moses says quite consistently. But where there is an appropriate blood sacrifice, then we can bring our work of our hands, our grain, into the temple. Well, for a Christian, of course, the blood sacrifice is Jesus, and it is Jesus' blood that makes our offering of our lives acceptable to God. But as we offer our lives to God, they must taste of something. They must taste of salt. Now, what I notice here, though, is it's something bigger than just my life. It says here that we are the salt of the earth. That seems to mean the salt of the whole earth. We are the salt that makes the whole earth taste better to God. That's a big thing, isn't it? I think it's good to remember that God loves all his creation. God loves humanity. He loves people. He likes to see his creation doing what it was made to do. So there are some things about this world that God likes. I think God loves to see when men responsibly work in his creation. When we make things and tend for the world in a proper way. Not everything we do is rubbish. Not everything we do is wrong. But there is something lacking in even the best that men and women do. And what is that thing that's lacking? It's the taste of salt. You, Christian believer, you are the salt of the earth. You are the thing that makes all of this world and all of humanity palatable to God. So it's people who love Christ who are the salt of the earth. People who worship in spirit and truth who are the salt of the earth. People who live and act and speak with Christian conviction, they are the salt of the earth. So don't worry about whether people notice your good deeds. That's a complete red herring. The important thing is, how do you taste to God? Can he taste me? Do we taste distinctive enough? Does the whole world taste different to God because we are praising, worshipping, serving and praying in a way that pleases him? So yes, we are the salt of the earth, just not in the way that most people think. Well, that's my thought for the day. I hope it helps, and I'm going to carry on with this passage tomorrow because we're going to look at being salt and light and so on. So for now, goodbye. May God bless you. May you be nice and salty on this beautiful day that God has given us. God bless you and goodbye.